Good evening and welcome. I'm Gennady Meyerson. I'm the founder of Russian Opera Workshop. This is our first ever event. This is our first workshop that we just did. It's a 2-month workshop. In June, we were focusing on the opera Eugene Onegin by Tchaikovsky. And in July, we have another session, and we will be working on Tchaikovsky's Youna. So what I would like to do before I'll explain what we're doing. First, we'll have a talk on Eugene Onegin, the original Pushkin story. And our guest speaker is Ilya Vinitsky from the University of Pennsylvania. Then, after that, if somebody has some questions, you're welcome to. Am I right, Ilya, right? So if there are any questions, raise your hand. And this is a fluid situation. We'll talk. And then we have a short, wonderful Russian Romances recital where we'll just introduce all the performers in this session. And so just a couple of words about Ilya Vinitsky. We met last summer, had a wonderful conversation, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have somebody who is an expert, I should say, in literature, and talk about this magnificent piece as we're doing the musical version of it by Tchaikovsky. Ilya Vinitsky is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He lectures extensively. He has lectured in Princeton, Harvard, Oxford, on and on and on. And he is a prolific author. He is currently working, I think you're still working on a book, right? I don't know the title, so I'm going to be limited in what I can tell you. But there is a wonderful association here, is that when Professor was traveling in Russia, he found in the archives a piece of music. It's actually just an a cappella, probably no more than 4 measures. And it's a piece that's kind of a part of a larger piece, but it's unknown what the extent of this find is. And we thought it would be wonderful, because there's an article that's already published online by his publishers that's associated with this book. And he asked to have a bass record this. It's an a cappella. And the bass on that recording, and it's online, and I'll find out and I'll send it if you want, anybody is interested. The bass is Nicholas Masters. Oh, yes, graduated from Academy of Vocal Arts, was a finalist at the Metropolitan Opera competition. Wonderful bass, and I think it's an exciting project that you did. So, at this point, let me introduce Ilya Vinitsky. Enjoy. Please.
Unusual. So when Yana offered to me to give a talk on Pushkin's original text, in conjunction with Russian opera in Philadelphia, I was definitely flattered and agreed immediately and wholeheartedly. Yet the very next moment I realized that there's something like risky and even quite controversial in my past. First of all, who wants to listen to a lecture before a concert? And specifically on literature, because I'm an expert in literature, and the only connection with the realm of music is that many years ago I taught classes in literature for students of Russian Academy of Music. And I recall that I usually place my hand on the piano and waved my right hand, but alas, the sounds I produced were too far from harmony. So this is perhaps a natural trauma, like of a literary professor involved with music. There's one more thing, one more concern, initial concern, after I already agreed to give a talk today. It is the following one. In Russia, we have 2 Eugene Onegins, Pushkin's original poem and Tchaikovsky's opera. Both are extremely influential, both are beloved by readers, public. In America, in the West, Tchaikovsky's Onegin definitely overshadowed Pushkin's, and most of people, students, perhaps do not know anything about Pushkin's poem, novel in verse, to be sure. Of course, there are many translations of Pushkin's epic poem into English, but the problem is scholars argue which translation is worse. It's really difficult to translate Pushkin, and I will elaborate on it, into any language. It's difficult to translate it into English. So most of my students who read Pushkin not in the original, but in English, do not just understand what is so cool in the work. So I usually recall a very old joke about a guy who says, you know, I do not like Caruso. Why? Did you listen to him? No, but my friend sang me his stuff. So in this case, we have here just a pale reproduction rather than a real. So to resolve all these problems, I decided to musicalize Pushkin in a way, metaphorically at least. So the theme or the topic of my today's talk is not just Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, the novel in verse. So I called my talk Pushkin's Voice, because I will talk specifically about the way how Pushkin creates his unique voice and conveys it into his poetic work, the novel in verse, which he began in 1823 and finished in 1830. So Pushkin Voice. Of course, I will also talk a bit about the general context and some facts about this work, which is of extreme importance for Russian literature, and the facts which might be interesting for the listeners, for the audience. So if at the end I manage to make Pushkin a little bit more audible to you guys, I would consider that my task was, well, the risk was justified. So a few words first about the general context. Pushkin's novel is closely connected to the age when it was composed. It was a unique period in Russian literature, a formative period, the period when Russian poetry as a complex entity came into being. And of course, Pushkin's contribution was tremendous to this very specific age. Basically, this is the 1820s to early 1830s, a very dynamic and a very productive period in Russian cultural development. By the middle of the 1820s, Russia had formed its first true canon of poetic work. Poetry of this period was highly theatrical, I would even say like masquerade. In keeping with Western traditions, Russian authors took on specific roles for themselves, which continue to be attached to their life and works. From this period, we have the myths of the Russian sybarite and dreamer Batushka, Ivan Krylov, the Russian Aesop, Ozerov, the exalted singer brought down by society, the abject melancholic poet Tchaikovsky, the hussar poet Denis Davidov, the citizen poet Rubinstein, and the poet exiled Baritone. Naturally, the actual biographies of these men were richer than these masks, and their poetry was more varied than each epithet might suggest. Nevertheless, this Renaissance-style play with classical roles was necessary for the formation of the young Russian poetic tradition. Western models needed to be naturalized and personalized. Russian poets had to feel themselves not as imitators, but rather as the heirs or even the rivals of Western poets. As a result, Russian poetry had been transformed from a more or less mechanical collection of verse, text, genres, and names, which are characteristic for the 18th century, to a kind of republic of letters, linked by shared themes, problems, and myths, and populated by concrete authorial figures, well known to readers. It was by the mid of 1820s when Alexander Pushkin, a very young poet, he was just turned 20, the author of love elegies, frivolous poems, inflammatory political lyrics, and innovative romantic narrative poems, was acknowledged by his fellow writers and the readers' public as the unquestioned head of the Russian literary Olympus. A unique feature of Pushkin's talent was that he tried himself in different genres. He tried different literary masks and roles of his contemporaries. He did this to just one specific role. And he, in any role, he was extremely successful, as if we could immediately grasp the very essence of this or that poetic model, convention, genre, or mask, and present it most eloquently, with a touch of irony, and extremely successful. So, like my daughter, who is charming in any outfit she wears. So that's okay. A little bit personalized for me. Yet it should be mentioned that there were barely a few thousand readers in Russia at this time. Works of literature appeared in editions of between 200 and 600 copies, and they rarely sold out. This showed significant growth from the 18th century, actually, when an edition of between 50 to 80 copies was considered good size. The best-selling books of the entire age were the first volume of Nikolai Karamzin's History of the Russian State, the first Russian serious history, which sold an unheard of 3,000 copies in a month. The country's population was about 40 million. We can get some idea of the number and composition of the Russian reading public of Pushkin's age from the subscriber list of the journal Herald of Europe, which started with 580 subscribers and quickly reached 1,200. The majority of readers were the nobles, most of whom resided in St. Petersburg and Moscow. All in all, the most realistic number of readers was about 1% of the entire population. I'm speaking, of course, about readers of literature. The literate population was undoubtedly greater. This was a far smaller reading public than in enlightened Western countries, especially France, Germany, or England. Most Russian authors were, and their readers, were from the gentry class and perceived their literary work as entertainment or romantic calling rather than a source of financial reward. A very interesting consequence of this very tiny group of readers and even smaller group of writers was that they formed a kind of family. And it creates a very specific aura for the literature of the time, especially Pushkin's. When we read Pushkin, we realize that he addresses to readers all the time as if they're his friends or relatives. And this intimate spirit of conversation, even chat, which is definitely lost in Russian literature of the consequent period. You cannot find anything like this in Tolstoy or in Dostoevsky. In War and Peace you can find something, but Tolstoy doesn't direct the text to us, the readers, unlike Pushkin and his contemporaries. So this spirit of the family, this very domestic aura, is very characteristic for Pushkin's literary world and for the novel and verse Eugene Onegin. In the East, between 1817 and 20, Pushkin became a celebrity. He was born in 1799, acquired the reputation of the enfant terrible of Petersburg society, and for a reason actually, I won't go into detail, and ended up exiled from the capital by order of the emperor himself. His major work of this period, an ironic epic poem, Ruslan and Lyudmila. Some of you perhaps know the opera by Glinka based on Pushkin's poem. So Ruslan and Lyudmila was published when its author was far away from the capital. As if lockstep with his exile, Pushkin wrote a biographical epilogue to Ruslan and Lyudmila, hinting at his misfortune. This epilogue revises the tone of the poem. The poem is really hilarious. In hindsight, it allows for an interpretation of the work as a nostalgic elegy to a happy and Eudoxian period. An important part of Pushkin's biographical myth would be formed by his period of exile. Pushkin compares himself to Ovid, a Roman poet, who had coincidentally been sent into exile to the same region by Emperor Augustus some 1800 years earlier. The opposition, age, youth, characteristic to Ruslan and Lyudmila and Pushkin's early poetry in general, is supplanted by another, a vegan opposition of a carefree then and an unhappy now, then versus now. In his novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, which was designed by the poet in 1823 as a continuation of the line of Ruslan and Lyudmila, the happy days of youth are described as a kind of paradise lost. And I would say this is one of the most important keys, as I believe, to the perception of Pushkin's epic. This nostalgic feeling for the youth, which is farther and farther away from the narrator. Here's about the history of the times. It had taken Pushkin 7 years, 4 months, and 17 days to write Eugene Onegin, as he calculated on 25th of September 1830. It was published in a serial form between 1825 and 1832. The first complete edition was published in 1837, and the currently accepted version is based, the first complete edition was published in 1833, and the currently accepted version is based on the 1837 publication. Interestingly, Pushkin calculated all these days. Many authors do this in literature, in music, in fine arts. They indicate the period when they were working on their works. But in Pushkin's case, it's very interesting because it was very personal, almost biographical. This is a very important part of his life, as if from the moment when he finished the novel, he looks back to the past and he recalls all these days and months and years when his novel had been growing with him, aging with the author. The genre of the work was also unique. Pushkin called it the novel in verse, which is already a kind of oxymoron. If the novel, it should be in prose. If it's in verse, this is poetry. Here Pushkin establishes a very interesting tradition of Russian literature of the 19th century, and I would say 20th century, when Russian authors tend to create some kind of hybrids, very strange new genres, as if they tried to depart from Western prototypes and to create something which they considered as their own. In 2 decades after Pushkin, Nikolai Gogol would write his magnus opus, The Dead Soul, which he called poema, and it is prose. So what is the novel in verse? Pushkin himself wrote in one of his letters, "As concerns my activities, I am now writing not a novel, but a novel in verse, a devil of a difference, Дьявольская разница in Russian. The devil is not in detail, but really in verse. This is just, imagine like Jane Austen novel and present it in verse, or any 18th or 19th century novel. Pushkin was very well read in English, but specifically in French, of course, literature. He plays with prosaic cliches. He plays with the very fact of prosaic speech. For example, he makes such a meaningless expression as or aha, poetically meaningful words, placing them in a rhythmic pattern. They immediately come into being, and it's joke that a very interesting experiment at the same time. In its final form of 1837, the novel consists of, I didn't count it, I found this information in Vladimir Nabokov's commentary on Pushkin, 5,541 lines and 389 stanzas of iambic tetrameter with feminine and masculine rhymes. Each stanza, Pushkin actually created his own stanza for this novel. So each stanza is made of 14 lines with a unique rhyme scheme, which was come to be known as the Onegin stanza or the Pushkin sonnet. Actually differs from Petrarchan model of sonnet or Shakespearean sonnet. It's an interesting combination, and it's a very brave artistic experiment. The last 2 lines, as in Shakespearean sonnet, rhymes, but the variety of rhymes creates a very fluid and at the same time very well constructed, almost architectural type of this dynamic stanza. Just let me quote the stanza in Russian. This is one of the most famous of Pushkin's stanzas, which portray the dance of a famous ballerina of Pushkin's age and a heroine of many scandals of his age, Istomina. And the last 2 lines portray how she dances, 2 of her feet beat each other, as Pushkin stages out the very stanza of his creation. Театр уж полон, ложи плещут, партеры, кресла, все кипит, в райке нетерпеливо плещут и, взвившись, занавес шумит. Блистательно, полувоздушно, смычку волшебному послушно, толпою нимф окружена, стоит Истомина. Она, одной ногой касаясь полу, другою медленно кружит, и вдруг прыжок, и вдруг летит как пух от уст Эола, то стан собьет, то разобьет, и быстро Bystry noshky noshku vjot. Here is an English translation by Nabokov. The theatre's full, the boxes glitter, parterre and stalls all bubbling, or on high they're clapping with impatience, the curtain rising can be heard, semi-ethereal and radiant, and to a magic bow obedient, surrounded by a crowd of neat. Istomina is standing. She, touching the floor with one foot, slowly is by the other turned around, a sudden bound, a sudden flight, like down from the lips of Aeolus. Her figure twists and then untwists, and a swift small foot with foot beats. So this is the pale literary translation of the stanza. The historians of ballet argue that Pushkin portrays Fouettet in this stanza, so it's a very interesting experiment of poetic reproduction of non-poetic art. The novel in verse consists of 8 chapters, with a appended passage from Onegin's Journey, which were to be placed between chapter 7 and 8. So it resembles the novel in its form, but in fact, again, this is novel in verse. Pushkin plays with prosaic constructions, devices, and creates something totally different. The characters of Eugene Onegin are even more familiar to Russian readers, as some Western critics argue, than are Jane Austen's 2 English ones. And for generations of the Russian intelligentsia, they presented a subject for discussion. Vladimir Nabokov wrote, "The novel is mainly concerned with the emotions, meditations, acts and destinies of 3 men, Onegin, the bored fop, Lenski, the minor elegiast, and a stylized Pushkin, Onegin's friend. There are 3 heroines, as Nabokov cast them: Tatiana, Olga, the sisters, and Pushkin's muse. The events are placed between the end of 1819 in St. Petersburg and the spring of 1825 in St. Petersburg again. In between, the action switches from St. Petersburg to the countryside, then to Moscow, then back to St. Petersburg, and in the appended chapter, which Pushkin decided not to include in the major corpus of the novel, Onegin travels from he visits Moscow, Novgorod, Volga region, the Caucasus, Crimea, and Odessa, repeating actually the route of the poet Pushkin himself. The plot of this epic is absolutely banal and very trivial. It's very easy to retell the plot of Eugene Onegin just in few words. It has also kind of mirror construction. Onegin, St. Petersburg fop, gets an inheritance from his uncle, whom he had never seen before, and he goes to the countryside. He is absolutely bored. He doesn't know what his plans for the future are, but the rules of the game are that he has to go and get this inheritance. Here he meets another Russian landlord, Lenski, a poet who came from Germany, from Göttingen, and who is profoundly romantic, like a parody of romantic poet, as well as a very nice young man in Pushkin's portrayal. Lenski brings Onegin to the family of the Larins, and Lenski is in love with the younger sister, Olga, a very cheerful creature, like Allegra of Milton, but Onegin finds much more interest in her older sister, Tatiana, who looks like Tanserova. She's very pensive, she's mysterious. Tatiana falls in love with Onegin. She writes a letter to Onegin. Onegin responds to her personally and tells her that he cannot fall in love with her. He is disillusioned with life. And I just don't want to retell this stuff. So they part, and in between Onegin feels Lenski. Again, I don't want to go into detail in this case because it will take me more time. And in the second half of the epic, Onegin visits St. Petersburg, and here he encounters Tatiana, which had totally changed. She had married a general, and she is now a high society and a very beautiful lady. Now Onegin writes a letter to Tatiana, she rejects, and this is the end of the poem.